Thanks, Commissioners. So my name's Mick Schuele. I work for the Cape York Institute within the Cape York Partnership structure, and we've had involvement, particularly on the Cape, for 15 years. And the Cape York Institute, some of you might be aware, it ran the welfare reform, the welfare reform trials that began in 2007 are a project run out of the Cape York Institute. We've also had empowered communities. More recently, we've had Palmer Futures, and we've had previous involvement, particularly with the Queensland Productivity Commission and their 2017 inquiry into the reforming service delivery in remote and discrete Indigenous communities in Queensland. So, for this particular inquiry, I'd like to thank the Queensland Productivity Commission for the opportunity to come and speak with you and to hear our views. We are making a more detailed, longer submission in addition to our initial submission at the moment, and we'll have that in the next couple of days. And I also know that Ms. Zoe Ellerman and Mr. Noel Pearson will come and speak with you at your Brisbane hearings on the 10th of May. So there'll be some additional points they make with the submission that's still being finalised at the moment. So thank you for your patience. So in our region of Cape York and far north of Queensland, we were particularly concerned for the very high rates and, in the last 10 years, increasing rates of imprisonment and recidivism for Indigenous people. Of course, our concern is for the people that are already in the system and that those numbers are growing, but our history of our involvement in this has been primarily focused on trying to address the underlying structural drivers that are leading to these very high rates of imprisonment and recidivism. So, just one thing with your report, there's not much mention of the youth detention numbers. I know it's not in your terms of reference explicitly, but it does give you an idea. You're 26 times more likely to be in youth detention in Queensland if you're Indigenous than if you're non-Indigenous. 26 times, and so it gives you, it's predictive, I suppose, of the continuing rapid rise in the adult prison population. So these structural drivers, as we heard from the previous speaker as well, they go right back to in utero. But that headline youth detention rate for Indigenous youth, and of course for non-Indigenous youth, it's catastrophic as well. But particularly that, for mainstream or for the imprisonment rate of adults, it's 10 times, but for youth, it's 26 times. So that's a big issue. So, this massive level of overrepresentation of Indigenous people, Indigenous youth in the prison system, it's not, too much we've been dealing with. It's the result of a system, and particularly in remote and discrete communities. I'd just like to come back to the 2017 QPC report, which really, it was probably the most important report released by the Queensland Government in 20 years. It really assessed the structural drivers and the fact we're still in this management and protection era concerning 25,000 First Nation Indigenous people in Queensland. And so I suppose for the draft report we were particularly disappointed to see that on page 85 you had half a page on the response to that, and in particular, I've got the printout of the page here. The heading for that discussion of that very important inquiry was, better service delivery in remote and discrete Indigenous communities. It's not about better service delivery. It's about the underlying structural reform and the history of that, but more importantly, what we do with it now, given the very high levels of disadvantage and all the sort of downstream consequences of that we're always sort of talking about in the headline indicators. So I guess the other side to that, and I'll just talk to this initially, but the Queensland Government's response in the last 18 months since that report was released, we've been talking to the Queensland Government, we've been trying to understand their thriving community's response, and given the quality of the Queensland Productivity Commission's inquiry, the response of the Queensland government so far is just it just doesn't pay any respect to the quality of the report that you did. We don't know what else is going on or what else is in the wings at the moment, but we feel that there is an opportunity for this inquiry that you're currently doing to restate your core findings of that inquiry that you did in 2017, and to also, I guess, ask the Queensland government, the Treasury, and that's it, where its response is at, and to give them the opportunity to respond within your final report. But for them to have 18 months and just to say, well, we're going to move now from a surviving to a thriving situation is quite crazy when there's nothing attached to that beyond the usual, measures, like, for example, diversion or more investment in local services. This is not a service delivery issue. There's a structural reform issue that was well articulated, and really we would like to see that re-articulated in line with our own thinking that we've made over the years, particularly empowered communities, Palmer Futures. So just to make one final point around the Queensland government's response, I mean, the one, I guess, structural policy reform that really was bipartisan across the Australian and Queensland government and was designed by KPL Communities was the Families Responsibilities Commission. And that is the one thing, in terms of the thriving communities response, that the Queensland government said they're going to cease, if you like. So there's opportunity within reform of the FRC to improve the outcomes with regard to imprisonment and recidivism with relation to the justice groups. So there's a real opportunity there, but I guess it's just emblematic of where we're at with the Queensland government, is that they don't see the opportunity for further reform or improvement, but they want to dismantle something, I suppose, that doesn't fit into their management and protection objectives. So yeah, in summary, I think we really would like to see the final report go back to restate those principles, and it's not about service delivery, it's about the structural reform. So one other thing that really stood out from the report is there was some good data discussion, and we thank you for the work, for the work in the report, but in particularly the differences between Indigenous and non-Indigenous, and the sort of reasons people are getting custodial sentences. So, at the national level, the ABS data shows that almost half of all Indigenous sentences are from acts intended to cause injury and unlawful entry with intent. So the point here is that we know a lot of these injury convictions for Indigenous people are linked to alcohol and substance abuse. So in addition to that, the report doesn't really make any mention of the link to alcohol management plans, and what the position is on those types on that particular issue from the government either. So I think there's an opportunity to make some very strong recommendations, and also to analyse the problem more clearly on that front. Yeah, just going back to one, like a lot of us know the 1991 Royal Commission to Aboriginal Deaths in Custody, and similarly to the QPC's 2017 report, one of the main findings of that Aboriginal Deaths in Custody report was that disempowerment and the structural dimensions is to blame for a lot of the problems back in 1991. I guess what the report didn't do back then, it came up with a set of recommendations that really, treated the symptoms. It didn't treat the underlying drivers. So that's what we have to learn from that history, and from the last 30 years where the rates of Indigenous incarceration, recidivism has gone up, is that, we have to get to the underlying structural causes, and we just can't this symptom thinking has to end. So, yeah, I think that's all I'll say on that. And there's definitely more discussion that will be coming from Ms. Ellerman and Mr. Pearson on the 10th of May in Brisbane around that. So I think, and that's pretty much, in terms of the draft report, sort of the comments we would like to make on that. And but there's plenty of room for discussion, obviously, within what I've said. Thank you.
Mick, you got questions?
Thanks for that. The underlying structure reform, it's a key issue for us to identify those. And I'm not about to mount a defence of the draft report. It was essentially to do exactly what you've done. It was to fly some kites and to get exactly that sort of response and tell us where we've still got some gaps or where we've got it wrong. And you've done a great job in doing that. I hear you loud and clear, and we'll make an effort to plug some of those gaps going forward. Do you want to give us an example of an underlying structural issue that really, it's one of the many things I suspect that really, we all should be concerned about and making efforts to solve?
Well, I think in terms of remote and discrete communities, you just have to look at the history of the mission era. You had the protection era, and government are quick to say, oh, we've got local councils, and they've got their own governance structures, but there's no rates base in these communities. Like, the councils are completely funded from the state government. They have no choice but to fall in line with what the state government. There are no local people don't have a normal relationship with their local level of government. It's very much a state government apparatus, the local councils. Yeah. And I'm not denigrating what they do, because they provide critically important services, and they do way more than a mainstream council. But if you understand the history of the mission era, the protection era, and then the movement to Aboriginal local government, this is not self-determination. We are still stuck, stuck in this service delivery paradigm that seems to strengthen year on year. So the reality is, people on the ground understand the problems that they face, and I've seen 20 years of work in some of these communities that, if government had backed this thinking 20 years ago, we would now be talking about something completely different. Yeah. And this is about human beings in a certain situation. This is not about being Indigenous. There's nothing Indigenous specific. This is, some of the unemployment rates are a good example of that too. So I don't know if you're aware, but the ABS does, a small labour market, does a very comprehensive small labour market survey. So for Yarrabah, for example, the unemployment rate's been hovering around 75%. For the last five years, and it's always been very high for the last 20 years. The participation rate's in the 30s. So that's 40 minutes down the road from Gordonvale, where there's a high level of unemployment from, mainstream standards, it's 8%, and the participation rate is 60%. But, to as a society and as a government tolerate that level of unemployment, and to say that we can get there with better service delivery or building things in the same way that we used to, when for 20 years local people have been telling people that it's not going to work, then I don't know if that answers your question about the example, but that's the situation. That is the current situation.
You answered it well. That's a great example. Yeah. I know there's many others. We haven't talked about alcohol. We haven't talked about health. We haven't talked about schooling. There's a whole range of them out there with fundamental structural problems.
People are recipients of they get services, but they really have very little local opportunity to improve their lives. But even where you've got mainstream labour markets down the road, for example, the linkages aren't there. There's just no, and to go back to the welfare reform project that was begun in 2007, there was the correct theory is there's been a collapse of social norms around a whole bunch of issues. And how do you rebuild those social norms? And the only way you can rebuild those social norms is through local authority and agency. We've seen it time and again. So the FRC is an example of that, where you're rebuilding local social norms, the social norms around local agency and authority, and it works. It really works. But
Mick, these aren't intractable problems. There are potential solutions if we have courage to embrace them.
Absolutely there are, yeah. And if you back the local people with their agency and authority, but it's working out what the role of government is in such an extraordinary situation and an extraordinary legacy, but to keep perpetuating a myth, I suppose, around what works when it actually doesn't work, it's costing a lot of money and it's not getting anywhere. And ultimately, the people on the ground are blamed for the lack of progress. But
that's right.
I'm not saying they're not. They have to be active players, but they have to also be given the right supports. So, yeah.
Thanks, Mick, for your presentation.
Okay.
And also for making reference to the 2017 QPC report. A significant amount of work was put into that, and a significant amount of work's gone into this today. But as I explained in the break, and I'll just let other people know, some of the data that we've recently received was slow in coming, both from government and a number of other agencies. And we've been getting that data over time, so you'll see a significant amount and a shift in some of the data as represented going into the final report, which is a good message to give everybody today. You mentioned the alcohol management plans, and I acknowledge we haven't gone into those in too much detail yet in the draft report. What is your thoughts around those in terms of going forward, in terms of the recommendation? Is it number one, Matt, around the looking at decriminalising or criminalising or maintaining the laws around some substances?
Yeah, so first off, I'll say I'm not an expert on AMPs, but I've had some involvement, and I would certainly encourage you to ask Mr. Pearson and Ms. Ellerman those questions in Brisbane. But in terms of my response to that is that, the AMPs have come under attack at various times, and it fundamentally misunderstands the foundation of the AMPs. The foundation of the AMPs is people in communities saying enough's enough. Like, we can't have a community where half of the community has got a real problem with alcohol, where we've got no policy as to the supply and policing of alcohol. So, people often get upset about the rights of drinkers. Well, what about the rights of the women and the children in that community? What about the rights of the unborn children, the kids that are in utero? So it's not a complete solution, but and people often say, well, prohibition doesn't work. Yeah, well, sure, but in these cases, if you didn't have the AMPs, what would be the situation? And things would be far worse. So it's an example of a policy that needs more support, and it maybe needs some more current thinking, but fundamentally it's got to be about supporting local agency and authority to take control of those AMPs, and what other services might need to hang off the AMPs. For example, the FRC, what other services can the FRC in those communities direct people that have got alcohol abuse, substance abuse addictions? So there's a coordination issue, but fundamentally I would say these things must be maintained, and to the degree that communities want to maintain them, and that it's up to government to get completely behind the local people in terms of how they want these things to look in the future. So, but that's not to listen to the noisy minority who complain about the rights of drinkers and the rights to sell alcohol. I mean, the history of this stuff is some of these communities, some of their base funding used to come from canteen sales.
Yeah.
It's ridiculous. Like, how can you have canteen sales being the funder of local government services? It's absolutely crazy. So we can never go back to that situation. And not that long ago, with the state government under the Newman government, that's where we were heading. We had representatives of major alcohol interests flying around the Cape saying we've got to reopen the canteens because there's money to be made. Well, no way we're going back to that. So.
What's the role of government in this issue, the Queensland government? How should they play in this space?
Well, I think going back to the QPCs, there's a lack of structures at the moment that can really engage with government. So, look, the councils do a really good job, but they're always under funding pressure. So I think there's got to be an effort to really to find a sub-regional voice and a regional voice on these matters. And whatever happens federally, I think there's scope for the Queensland government to come up with its own solution in this space. And the QPC's 2017 report's got all of the recommendations you'll ever need on that. You know, there's got to be an interface between government and community, and it can't just be the local government. They have a critical role to play, but for what I just outlined before, they are a dependent arm of the state government. They can't be relied upon, nor are they representative of the entire, you know, of all the issues that are there. So how you create those structures, the Cape regional organisations have thought about those issues a lot as well, and it's on the public record. So, but in answer to your question, Kim, the Queensland government needs to think about the structures it engages with. It can't just defer all the decision making to local councils.
We hear you and we understand.
Yeah. Okay.
Did you have another question?
No, that's okay.
At this point, I'll open it up to the floor if there's any questions from other members of the audience here today. Yes, please remember to state your name.
Sure.
And where you're from.
Camille Banks, I'm from the Family Responsibilities Commission. I guess I just wanted to add something or contribute to the discussion if I can. It seems to me that some of the, I guess, new justice strategies that the Queensland Government in fact already supports in other areas, like the restorative justice system and juvenile justice, and the, I guess, the move towards justice reinvestment strategies, would dovetail really well into something like the FRC, where the response is a community response, it's an early intervention kind of conferencing response rather than, you know, immediately being a criminal justice response, which, you know, runs into problems with criminalising people really quickly with AMPs. But I guess, yeah, so my comment, I guess, is that some of these things that the Queensland Government already support work really well with the Indigenous authority structures that exist in the FRC in other ways, but that link isn't being made. So yeah, I guess that's.
So yeah, I totally agree with. I mean, we would totally agree with that. And there's just this opportunity being missed because the FRC should have evolved quite significantly over its lifetime, and that was no lack of trying by the FRC or the regional orgs. But you know, the FRC's had a series of one-year extensions to its mandate and to its operation, and so, you know, I remember back when the FRC was first being thought of, and someone said in government, "Oh, well, how long do you need?" And I said, "Oh, well, we need about 20 years." Like, you know, just laughter. You know, so well, that's the truth. So now we've had 11 or 12 years after initial 3 or 4 year trial, and I think a big problem is the short-term sort of funding extensions. So that never gives you any space to sort of do the sort of things you're talking about there. And just to make one more point about the FRC has done a fantastic job, but it really has struggled with that hardcore group of people and community who, once you conditionally income manage, and once you've had the hard conversations with the commissioners, there's not much more you can do. So it needs more tools in its arsenal in terms of what the local commissioners, who are the voices of Indigenous agency and authority, not just punitive, but they're measures of support. You know, you need more measures of support. So, and that is the critical moment where someone may be just before entering the criminal justice system and first custodial term, and that's what the Queensland government should say. Well, that is the opportunity. Maybe not early intervention, but it's not too late stage intervention to help somebody. So yeah.
Thanks, Mick. Anyone else? Eddie?
Eddie Pearce again from Lifeblood Australia. Just listening to what you've had to say, the speaker before basically touched on early intervention as well, and you also reinforced that. And just from what you're saying, I mean, I'm a bit of a layman here, but to say that it seems like agencies tend to get tied up with their political agenda as such, rather than just coming down to human levels and dealing with things on a much simpler platform, if I can put it that way. So I haven't really got a question, but just to say that the common comment of early intervention has at least reoccurred twice now. And I know it's something that I'll be mentioning, but you know, unless we can get to that root level stuff, a lot of these other things with drugs and alcohol and whatever it is, they'll just keep on reoccurring.
Absolutely, and early intervention is it's in utero. You know, we just heard about FASD. Like, you know, if you know, there's no worse. That's a terrible start for a child. I mean, it's not that the parents don't love the child, but developmentally, that child can never bridge that gap. So, and so if you can do things that avoid as many of those situations as possible, even bring it to mainstream rates. I mean, there's just got to be a full court press on that in terms of the reform that's needed to achieve that. You know, yeah. So,
Are you optimistic, Mick, about the future?
Oh, 100%. I'm optimistic because even in my 10, 12 years that I've been lucky enough to be involved with this, you know, I've seen enormous changes, but enormous changes for the positive. But it varies from place to place. It's not the same everywhere. And I think it's another issue that we sort of lump Indigenous people into one, you know, homogenous category. These are discrete First Nations, and I think if there's, and I shouldn't be the one telling you this, you know, people from First Nations should be telling you this, but you know, every place has its own identity and will have its own way to develop its solutions. And even with the QPC's 2017 report, you know, you can have structural reform, but there will be different speeds that different places develop. And I would say you know, if there's a spectrum or a continuum, like some places have really, you know, I've really seen rapid improvement, and it's not even because anyone else is involved; they've done it themselves. But then other places the problems are so great, if you like. And also, I would say that the government response sometimes has just, you know, I don't want to mention any particular place, but you know, the service delivery response is so overwhelming in its quantity and its level that you know, it ceases to be a place where people identify as their hometown. It's a service delivery hub, you know. And then a lot of the decision making you see is about how do we get, where do we house the police, where do we house the agents of service delivery, rather than what does the community think about this. So yeah, so yeah, I am optimistic, very optimistic, but there are things as a nation that, and I think we're about to reach that point federally where you know, Australia's got a lot of growing up to do, but I think there's stuff that Queensland can do off its own bat, not have to wait for any federal movement. So yeah.
Just another comment. You mentioned about community in a particular area having an impact on the way that they're progressing forward. It's something that I have certainly come across where individuals in the community seem to recognise that there are issues, and it probably just takes for someone to step forward, create the lead, push for that group to take it to the next level, because for some reason, don't know why, but like, you know, government just don't seem to have that relationship connection. I think that's a good way to put it. So it's, you know, if you can take models from those communities that are doing it well and endeavour to maybe reciprocate those in other areas, perhaps.
Yeah, I think it's a local leadership issue, and there are fantastic natural leaders in all the places, and I meet them every day, and I just, you know, I'm always so impressed. Or just, you know, they're just remarkable human beings, you know, and they're the ones you just have to back in each place. So, and I think coming back to the structural interface, the natural leaders, that's the people you really have to, you know, hear the voice of and consistently hear the voice of that. And then you can come up with a 5-year plan or a 10-year plan, but it starts with this aspiration, what the future is, and then you have absolute consistency with trying to meet those challenges. But you've got to back those local natural leaders. So, yeah.
Any other questions here from the floor? Okay, we've still got a little bit of time, Mick, so I'm going to hand it back to you for any final comments or points that you want to just go over in terms of your presentation. You've got a little bit of time.
So,
Mick, I wouldn't mind also hearing a little bit about what's got you here, this particular part of your life. Why here? Why now? What? Why?
Look, I think anyone that works in this area, from a public policy point of view, there are a lot of very difficult problems that in Australia, and my background's from public policy with the Federal Productivity Commission. I've worked for the Federal Treasury, and when you initially understand the situation, particularly with remote and discrete communities and the history of it, and you start to think about the policy issues, I think that you can't help but want to be involved.
Yep.
To try and help with that situation. I think this is look. There's a lot of challenging things in public policy, but in terms of, for me, this is a very big public policy issue for Queensland.
Yep.
That I think we've now got enough understanding of what the problem is. It's now time to really do something significant. So in terms of Indigenous overrepresentation in the criminal justice system, it's a standalone. It's got so many headlines. We've been talking about it for 30 years, but we've had report after report, even setting targets. There was, we've mentioned a report in here from 2000, but there was a partnership report between the Queensland government and the communities in 2000. It said there was going to be a 50% reduction in the imprisonment rate by 2010. And it went exactly the opposite way. There was a 50% increase. So, at some stage you have to go back and say, well, this isn't working. And there's no command and control public policy answers in this space. It has to be local agency and authority, particularly given the remoteness and the discrete nature of these communities. So yeah, I wish there wasn't so much work for public policy in this, but there is, and I'm happy to be involved in it, continue to be involved. So just if I've got a minute.
Sure.
Yeah, I think it's just to re-highlight the point from the FRC. Sorry, I've forgotten your name, but from the FRC, Camille. There's just a lot more opportunity, I think, to link the service delivery system that really is the state's service delivery system with the sort of things that the FRC is trying to do. So with the local justice groups, with the magistrates court. There's just sort of a moment now to have some clear thought. I'd be interested, the collective minds of the QPC, to have a look at that particular issue and to make some comment, because I know you've got a good understanding of what the FRC does, the history of it, and maybe the FRC's future is absolutely under threat at the moment. So, what are your views on the FRC and that type of reform, and what are the opportunities in this particular sphere for the FRC to improve what it's doing and to be a central point for re-establishing agency and authority, but making the Queensland service delivery system work, for all those people, and particularly that harder core group that at the moment the FRC really hasn't had much opportunity to work with. Yeah. Anything else, colleague? No.
Thanks, Mick.
Well done, Mick. That was very helpful.
Thanks for your presentation, and just a reminder to everyone, that's Mick Schuele from the Cape York Institute, just presented now. So we do have a bit of time. We're going to go to a break, just 5 minutes, and then we'll start again, reconvene again with Jeff Nelson, clinical psychologist. Thank you. Thanks.
Thank you. Well done, Mick. Thank you very
Thank you.
much.